The moment Adelaide Ralston pressed her lips together and told Grant Granger that he was too late, the whole world seemed to hold its breath, and Grant, dusty and sun-beaten from 3 weeks on the trail, simply looked at her with those dark amber eyes and said, "Tell me what too late means, Adelaide, and I will prove you wrong." The year was 1874, and the town of Caldwell Creek, Kansas, sat on the edge of everything, on the edge of the frontier, on the edge of civilization, and on the edge of a silence that had been growing between two people for longer than either of them had the courage to admit. Caldwell Creek was not a glamorous place. It had one main street rutted deep with wagon tracks, a general store run by the Fletcher family, a saloon called the Dusty Rail that smelled of sawdust and bad whiskey, a livery stable where horses stamped and snorted through the long hot afternoons, a small white church that leaned slightly to the left as though it had grown weary of standing straight, and a post office that doubled as the town's telegraph station. It also had a schoolhouse, modest and squat, where Adelaide Ralston had been teaching the children of Caldwell Creek for the past 2 years. Adelaide was 24 years old. With chestnut hair, she kept pinned at the nape of her neck and brown eyes that held the kind of quiet intelligence that made people feel simultaneously comforted and seen through. She was not a woman who carried herself with false pride, but she had a spine like iron and a heart like open land, vast and honest and occasionally unforgiving. She had come to Caldwell Creek from St. Louis in the spring of 1872, after her father died, and left her with very little beyond a small inheritance, a stubborn character, and a schoolteacher's certificate issued by the state of Missouri. She had answered an advertisement in the newspaper seeking a schoolteacher for a growing frontier town, packed everything she owned into a single trunk, and arrived on the westbound stage with chalk dust still on her fingers and a determination in her eyes that the stagecoach driver had privately found a little intimidating. For the first year in Caldwell Creek, she had been mostly alone. Not unhappy, not exactly, but alone in the particular way that comes when a woman builds a life entirely from scratch, with no family nearby and no old friends to lean on. She taught reading and arithmetic and geography to the children of ranchers and merchants and the occasional drifter who settled long enough to enroll a child in school. She made friends slowly and carefully with some of the women in town, Martha Fielding at the general store, and a quiet woman named Esther Vance, whose husband ran the livery. She attended Sunday services at the Listing White Church and brought pies to socials, and mended her own fence when it blew down in the autumn storms. She was, by any measure, a woman who had learned to be sufficient unto herself. Grant Granger had ridden into Caldwell Creek in the autumn of 1872, about 6 months after Adelaide arrived, with nothing but a good horse named Copper, a bedroll, a Winchester rifle, and the kind of reputation that precedes a man who knows cattle and horses better than he knows anything else on earth. He was 27 years old at the time, lean and weathered, with dark amber eyes that caught the light in ways that were quietly distracting, and a jaw that always carried at least 2 days of stubble no matter how recently he had shaved. He had been born in Texas, raised on a cattle ranch outside of San Antonio, and had spent his 20s doing trail drives up the Kishom Trail, Abilene, Wichita, and now Caldwell Creek, which was just beginning to position itself as a cattle shipping point. He was skilled and dependable and well regarded by the ranchers who hired him, and he had no particular plan beyond the next drive, no roots planted anywhere, and no clear idea of what a settled life might look like. The first time he met Adelaide, it had been entirely accidental. He had been walking out of the general store with a tin of coffee and a paper-wrapped wedge of cheese, and she had been coming in, carrying a stack of primers under one arm and a basket over the other, and they had collided squarely in the doorway. The primers went one way and the coffee went another, and for a moment they both just stood there in the wreckage of the collision looking at each other with more surprise than irritation. "I beg your pardon," he said, and began picking up the books. "It is entirely my fault," she said at the same moment, and bent to retrieve the coffee tin. They handed each other's belongings back with a kind of careful formality, and she thanked him, and he touched the brim of his hat, and that should have been the end of it. Instead, he found himself asking whether those were school books, and she said yes, and he asked whether she was the new teacher, and she said she supposed she was, since she had been teaching for 6 months and was not sure at what point she became the established teacher rather than the new one. He thought about that for a moment and said he reckoned 6 months was enough time to stop being new at anything. She gave him a look that was equal parts amusement and appraisal, and said she was not sure that was true of everything. And then she went into the store, and he stood on the boardwalk for a moment longer than he needed to before heading back toward the livery. He asked about her at the dusty rail that evening, casually, the way a man asks about things he is trying to pretend he is not very interested in. He learned her name and that she had come from St. Louis, and that she was well-liked and considered serious and capable, and not easily impressed. He also learned, from a ranch hand who offered the information with an encouraging grin, that she was unmarried, which he had assumed but was somehow glad to have confirmed. Over the following months, they moved around each other with the careful deliberateness of two people who are aware of each other without quite knowing what to do with that awareness. He encountered her at church, at the general store, at the social gatherings that marked the seasons in Caldwell Creek. He tipped his hat. She acknowledged him with a composed nod. Occasionally they exchanged a few words, about the weather, about the cattle markets, about a book she mentioned having read that he surprised her by having read as well. He had taught himself to read at the age of 14 from his mother's Bible and a donated copy of David Copperfield, and he read slowly but thoroughly, and retained everything. And she found this out gradually, in pieces, the way you find things out about a person when you are paying attention without appearing to. By the spring of 1873, they had settled into something that might be called a careful friendship. She had begun to look forward to the Sunday mornings when she knew she would see him at the church, and he had started to time his visits to the general store with a rough knowledge of when she tended to come in for her weekly supplies. They did not discuss this mutual engineering. Neither of them had the vocabulary for it yet, or perhaps neither of them had the courage. It was at the spring social in May of 1873 that things shifted. The social was held in the cleared space behind the church, with lanterns strung on ropes between the posts, and a fiddle player named Old Clem, who played with more enthusiasm than precision. Adelaide arrived with Esther Vance, and Grant arrived with 2 other ranch hands who promptly found themselves drawn to the whiskey that someone had brought in a stone jug. Grant lingered at the edge of the dancing and watched Adelaide talking with Martha Fielding, and felt something pull in his chest like a rope gone taut. He crossed the space between them and asked her to dance, and she looked at him for a moment with those frank brown eyes and said yes, and he took her hand, and they danced to Old Clem's imprecise fiddle for 2 songs, close enough that he could smell the soap she used, something with lavender, and far enough apart to be entirely respectable. When the music stopped, they stood for a moment without stepping back, and the evening air was warm and smelled of grass and horses and someone's wood smoke, and she looked up at him and said, very quietly, "You are not quite what I expected you to be, Grant Granger." And he said, "What did you expect?" She thought about it honestly and said, "A man with no interior life, a man who was only ever passing through." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I am passing through. I have a drive to Wichita in the fall." "I know," she said, and she stepped back, and the distance between them returned, and he did not know what to say that would make it smaller again. He left for Wichita in September of 1873. He had told himself all summer that he would say something to her before he left, something that would make his intentions clear and give her something to hold onto while he was gone. He had composed various versions of this speech in his head while he was riding fence and branding cattle, and doing the 100 physical tasks of ranch work that leave the mind free to roam. None of the versions felt adequate. He did not have a home to offer her. He did not have a clear future or a piece of land, or any of the things he imagined a woman like Adelaide Ralston would require before she would consider a man seriously. He had a horse and a good reputation, and a desire so strong it had begun to feel like a permanent condition, like weather. The night before he left, he went to find her. She was on the porch of the small house the school board provided for the teacher, reading by the last of the daylight with a lamp lit on the small table beside her chair. She looked up when she heard his boots on the steps and set down her book, and something in her expression changed, became careful, or perhaps became carefully composed. He stood with his hat in his hands and told her he was leaving in the morning. She said she knew. She had heard he was going with the Harlow Ranch Drive. He said yes, and that he would be back in the fall, probably late October or early November, and he looked at her with everything he wanted to say pressing hard against the back of his teeth, and what came out was, "I wanted to say goodbye." She held his gaze for a moment and then looked out at the street, where the last gold light was fading from the dust, and she said, "Goodbye, Grant. Be careful on the trail." Her voice was kind and steady and gave him nothing to hold on to, and he did not know whether that was because she felt nothing or because she was better at concealment than he was. He put his hat back on and touched the brim and went back down the steps and rode Copper to the livery, and the whole way he felt like a man who has dropped something valuable and cannot quite identify what it was. He was gone for 3 months. The drive to Wichita was long and difficult, with an unseasonably wet October that turned the trail to mud and cost them 2 weeks and one good steer to a river crossing that went wrong. He wrote a letter to Adelaide from Wichita, something he had not planned to do until he found himself sitting in a hotel room on a rainy evening with paper and a pen that belonged to the hotel and a feeling like a door left open that needed closing. He wrote 2 paragraphs and then crossed out everything he had written and started again and wrote 4 more paragraphs and read it over and felt that it was too much and too honest and probably inadvisable, and then folded it and addressed it and sent it anyway, because the rain kept falling and the feeling would not go away. The letter said that Wichita was loud and smelled of cattle and commerce, and that he found himself thinking about Caldwell Creek more than he had expected to, and about certain conversations they had had, and certain things she had said that he kept returning to, and that he hoped she was well, and that the schoolchildren were not giving her too much trouble. He did not say everything he wanted to say, but he said enough that anyone paying attention would understand what the letter was really about. He rode back to Caldwell Creek in late November, through a landscape that had gone gray and cold and bare, with the wind coming down from the north with serious intent. He stopped at the post office first, before even going to the livery, to see if there was a reply. There was. Adelaide's handwriting was precise and clear, the handwriting of someone who had taught writing for a long time and could not help but make each letter correctly formed. The letter said that Caldwell Creek had been quiet in his absence, that the children were learning well, and that young Tommy Fletcher had finally mastered long division, which had been a minor miracle. It said that the weather had turned sharply and that she had put the garden to bed for the winter. And near the end, in a paragraph that was slightly shorter than the others, as though she had weighed each word carefully, it said that she had read his letter several times and that she was glad he had written, and that she found herself looking forward to his return more than she had perhaps anticipated. He read that paragraph twice standing in the post office with the cold coming through the gaps in the boards, and then he folded the letter very carefully and put it in his breast pocket and went to stable Copper. When he saw her that evening at the general store, where she was buying flour and he was buying nothing at all because he had simply stopped in on the chance that she would be there, something had shifted between them. They both felt it. The careful politeness was still there, but it was thinner now, worn through in places by the letters and the absence and the looking forward too. They talked for 20 minutes in the warm interior of the general store, while Martha Fielding pretended to organize things behind the counter. And at the end of the 20 minutes, he asked Adelaide whether she would like to take a walk on Sunday after services, and she said yes, and Martha Fielding did not quite manage to suppress a smile. The walks became a regular occurrence through the winter of 1873 and into the spring of 1874. Sunday afternoons after church, they walked the edges of the town and talked about everything about books and the nature of the frontier, and what it was like to grow up in Texas, and what it was like to grow up in St. Louis, and what they wanted and what they feared, and what the future looked like from where each of them stood. He told her about his mother, who had died when he was 19, and about his father, who was still working cattle in Texas and growing old. She told him about her own father, a bookish man who had never quite found his footing in the commercial world, who had loved her completely and left her almost nothing. She told him about her decision to come west, which had seemed like desperation at the time and had become something closer to salvation. He watched her face while she talked and felt with increasing certainty that she was the most compelling person he had ever known, and that he was in deep trouble in the best possible way. In March of 1874, on one of their Sunday walks, when the first tentative green was coming back to the land and the air still carried a cold bite but was beginning to soften, he stopped walking and turned to face her and said, "Adelaide, I would like to court you, formally, if you are agreeable." She looked at him with those brown eyes that could see through to the back of a thing, and she said, "I thought we had been doing something very like that already, Grant Granger." "We have," he said. "But I wanted to be clear about what I intend. I do not want you to think I am merely passing through." She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the grass. Then she said, "What do you intend?" And he said, "I intend to stop passing through." The expression that moved across her face then was one he had not seen before, something unguarded and warm that she recovered quickly, schooling her features back to that composed steadiness. But he had seen it, and he held it in his mind like something precious. "All right," she said. "Court me then, Grant Granger, but I should tell you that I am not a woman who is easily persuaded, and I have requirements." He smiled, the slow, wide smile that transformed his habitually serious face. "Tell me your requirements." She thought about it with genuine seriousness and said, "I require honesty. I require that a man not tell me what he thinks I want to hear, but tell me what is true. And I require that if a man intends to stay, he actually stays." He held her gaze. "That is fair," he said. "And honestly, Adelaide, I could ask for nothing better than the chance to earn you." She turned slightly pink at that, which was one of the few times he ever saw her disconcerted, and they walked back to town in the gentle early spring air with something between them that was warm and new and fragile with potential. The spring of 1874 was, by the reckoning of most of Caldwell Creek, a beautiful one. The cattle market was strong, the crops were promising, and the town was growing. 2 new families had arrived from Ohio, and there was talk of a proper bank being established, and perhaps a telegraph line extended from Wichita. Adelaide was at the center of the town's growing life in the ways that teachers always are, known to nearly every family, present at every important occasion, indispensable in ways that are seldom formally acknowledged. And Grant Granger was at the center of her own life in ways that were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore or minimize. He took her to supper at the hotel dining room on her birthday in April, which was the first time anyone in Caldwell Creek would have called their association something as deliberate as a date. Martha Fielding and Esther Vance were, by general agreement, approximately beside themselves with satisfaction. He brought her wildflowers he had picked from the draw west of town, slightly bedraggled from being carried in his saddlebag, and she put them in a tin cup of water on her kitchen table and left them there until they were completely past saving. He noticed this several days later when he came to call, and the flowers were still on the table, long since dried to papery shadows, and something about that made his chest ache in a good way. In May, he started talking seriously about land. There was a parcel east of town that one of the ranchers, old Ed Birch, was willing to sell at a price that was within the reach of what Grant had saved from 3 years of trail drives. It was not large, but it was enough for a house and a kitchen garden and perhaps a small herd. He talked to Ed Birch. He talked to the banker in Wichita by letter. He walked the land twice, once alone, and once with a rancher named Cal Deering who knew the water situation of every piece of land within 20 miles. He did not tell Adelaide any of this while he was doing it. He did not want to make promises about a future that was not yet secured. That caution, that particular silence, was the first thread of the unraveling. In June of 1874, two things happened that changed everything. The first thing was that a man named Douglas Phelps arrived in Caldwell Creek from the east. He was 32 years old, the son of a successful merchant family from Cincinnati, and he had come to Kansas looking to invest in land and cattle. He was well dressed by the standards of Caldwell Creek, a broadcloth suit, good boots, a gold watch chain, and he was educated and articulate and possessed of the kind of polished surface charm that makes a very good first impression. He took a room at the hotel and began making himself known in the town, and within a week he had met Adelaide at one of the church socials and had charmed her sufficiently that she agreed to allow him to call on her. Grant learned about this from Esther Vance's husband Tom, who mentioned it in passing at the livery, and the information went into Grant like a cold blade. He told himself it was nothing, that Adelaide was a woman entitled to receive callers, that he had not yet said everything that needed saying, had not yet offered what needed offering. He told himself all of this in a voice that was rational and controlled, and underneath it he felt something close to panic. The second thing that happened in June was the Harlow Ranch drive. Frank Harlow, the rancher Grant had worked for since arriving in Caldwell Creek, came to him with an offer that was substantial. He needed a trail boss for a drive to Dodge City, nearly 400 cattle, a crew of 8, a contract already in place with a buyer at the other end. The pay was more than Grant had made in any previous year. It was, Harlow said, the kind of job that could set a man up, and the timing was immediate. They would leave in 3 days. Grant stood in Harlow's office and looked at the numbers on the paper and thought about the land east of town and the conversation he had not yet had with Adelaide and the man named Douglas Phelps with his good boots and his gold watch chain. He thought about all of it for a long moment. Then he said yes, he would take the job. He told himself he would talk to Adelaide before he left. He would tell her about the land and his intentions and ask her to wait for him, properly, with all the words he had been holding back. He rehearsed it while he was organizing the crew and checking the equipment and doing the 100 things that a trail boss does before a drive. He was going to tell her everything. He came to her house the evening before they were to leave. It was a warm June night, the air thick with the smell of summer grass, and she was sitting on her porch again, reading as she often did in the evenings. She looked up at the sound of his boots on the steps, and this time her expression was not carefully composed. It was something harder to read, something that had both warmth and a kind of reserve in it that had not been there the previous month. He sat down on the step and told her he was leaving in the morning. He watched her face as he said it. She put her book down very carefully and looked out at the summer darkness beyond the porch and said, "I know. Tom Vance mentioned it." "I should have told you myself," he said. "Yes," she said without inflection. "You should have." He sat with that for a moment because it was just, and then he said, "I need to tell you some things, Adelaide." She looked at him then, fully, with those brown eyes that could see through to the back of a thing. He started to tell her about the land, about Ed Birch's parcel, and the conversations he had been having, and the money he was saving. He started to explain why he had said yes to the drive, that the pay would give him what he needed to finish securing the purchase, that he was not simply wandering off again without direction. He started to say what he had needed to say for months. And Douglas Phelps came around the corner of the street. He was not looking for either of them, as far as Grant could determine. He was simply walking, the way men do in pleasant summer evenings, and he happened to pass by and saw Adelaide on the porch and raised his hat and said good evening, and Adelaide said good evening in return, and for a moment all three of them were caught in a tableau that felt, to Grant, almost unbearably pointed. After Phelps had passed, Grant looked at Adelaide and Adelaide looked at Grant, and something in the moment had been disturbed beyond his ability to recover it. He said, "I should let you get your rest," and stood up. He could hear himself doing it, making the same mistake he had made the previous September, and he could not seem to stop. Adelaide stood as well. She held herself very straight. She said, "Grant, I need you to know that Mr. Phelps has expressed an interest in—" She stopped, started again. "He has asked to call on me." Grant held his hat in both hands and looked at her and said, "What have you told him?" She said, "I told him I would think about it." He said, "Adelaide," and then stopped, because everything that needed to be said required more time than he had, and a steadiness of mind he had momentarily lost, and he was leaving in the morning, and he did not know how to compress what he felt into the right shape quickly enough. She looked at him with something that might have been an invitation or might have been a question, and he said, "I will be back in 2 months. I would ask you to wait." She said very quietly, "I have been waiting, Grant." And there it was. He heard it. He heard all of it. But the morning was coming and the drive was committed, and Frank Harlow had 400 cattle depending on him, and the words he needed kept sliding out of reach like water on slope. He said, "I know. I know that, Adelaide. And when I come back I will," she said. "Good night, Grant." And she went inside, and the door closed, and the lamp moved behind the curtain, and he stood on the step for a moment longer than he should have, and then went to prepare for the drive. He was gone for 8 weeks. It was the longest 8 weeks of his life, and not because of the trail. The trail was what it always was, hard and physical and demanding in ways that usually absorbed all available mental energy. But in the spaces between, in the evenings around the fire and the long, slow hours of night riding when the cattle were quiet and the stars were enormous overhead, he thought about Adelaide constantly. He thought about the way she had said, "I have been waiting, Grant," and the weight of those 4 words. He thought about Douglas Phelps and the gold watch chain and the polished surface charm. He thought about the things he had not said quickly enough and the morning that had arrived like a wall between him and the time he needed. He wrote her a letter from Dodge City, longer and more direct than the previous one. He told her that he was coming back. He told her about the land east of town and what he wanted to build on it. He told her, in words that were imperfect and plainly meant, that he had feelings for her that had become central to the way he understood his own life, and that he was asking her, formally and sincerely, to give him the chance to say all of this in person when he returned. He signed it and sealed it and posted it, and then spent the remainder of the drive alternating between relief that he had said it and dread that he had said it too late. He drove the herd to Dodge City in 8 days, concluded the deal, paid the crew, and rode back to Caldwell Creek in the first week of August, pushing copper harder than he usually would, covering the distance in 5 days. He rode into town in the late afternoon of a Thursday with the sun throwing long gold shadows across the street, and he was dusty and trail-worn and had not properly shaved in a week. And the first thing he did, before even the livery, was go to find Adelaide. She was coming out of the schoolhouse when he found her, carrying an armful of papers she had been grading, still dressed in the light blue dress she wore for teaching on summer session days. She saw him coming from halfway down the block and stopped, and he watched a series of expressions move across her face in quick succession: surprise, relief, something warmer that she pulled back quickly. He came up to her on the boardwalk outside the school and stopped. They looked at each other. He took his hat off, partly because the gesture required it and partly because he needed something to do with his hands. She said, "You are back." He said, "I wrote you a letter from Dodge City." She said, "I received it." He waited. Something in her face was careful in a way it had not been before, careful with a kind of pain underneath it that made him want to reach out and take her hand. She said, "Grant, I need to tell you something." He said, "All right." She looked down at the papers in her arms and then back up at him, and she said, "While you were gone, I accepted Douglas Phelps's formal proposal of courtship." The afternoon seemed to go very still. He said, "His courtship." She said, "Yes." He said, "Not marriage." She said, "No, not yet, courtship." She met his eyes. "He is here, Grant. He is present, and he has been clear, and he has said what he intends." The words landed with the precision of something aimed. He heard the implication, which was not cruel but was honest in the way Adelaide was always honest, sometimes past the point of comfort. He heard he said what he intends, and understood that he had failed to do this clearly enough and soon enough, and that she had eventually turned toward someone who had not. He looked at her for a long moment, all the dust of the trail on him and all the things he should have said weeks ago pressing against the back of his throat, and he said, "Adelaide, I am sorry that I was not clearer sooner. That is my failing. But I am here now, and I am asking you to hear me." She said, "Grant," he said, "I am not finished." There was something in his voice then, quiet and firm, that made her go still. He said, "I have been a man who was afraid to plant himself because planting means you can be lost, and everything I loved before I came here I lost eventually, and that has made me cautious in ways that have not served you well. I know that. And I know that I have waited too long to say things that needed saying." He stopped, started again. "But I am asking you, Adelaide, do not let this be finished without hearing what I have to say." She looked at him with those frank, clear, careful eyes, and the pain he had seen under the surface had become something else, something complicated and uncertain and very much alive. She said, very quietly, "You are too late, Grant." And he looked at her and he said, "Tell me what too late means, Adelaide, and I will prove you wrong." The words fell between them like something dropped from a great height, and she felt them land. He said it with the quiet conviction of a man who had come back across 100 miles of open country to say exactly this, and meant every syllable of it, and she could see that he meant it, and it made everything harder and more tangled and more important all at the same time. She said, "It means I have given my word to another man." He said, "Courtship is not a contract, Adelaide. No vows have been spoken. No promise has been made that cannot be reconsidered." She said, "My word means something to me." He said, "I know it does. And I am not asking you to break your word carelessly. I am asking you to consider whether you gave it to the right man." The air between them was charged with something that had the quality of a summer storm, all that heat and pressure with the rain not yet falling. She pressed the papers in her arms more tightly against her chest. She looked at him, at his earnest dusty face and his hat in his hand and his amber eyes that held everything he had not said for the last 2 years. She said, "What is it you want, Grant Granger? Say it plainly." He said, "I want you, Adelaide. I want to build a life in this place with you. I want to buy that land east of town from Ed Birch and put a house on it and work it and grow old in it. With you." He paused. "I want to ask you to marry me, but I know I have not earned that yet, not today, standing here in my trail dust having said everything too late and too slowly. So I am not asking that today. I am only asking that you give me the chance to prove that I mean what I say." She stared at him. The afternoon light fell across his face and illuminated the sincerity in it, plain as the sky above them. She said, "And what do I say to Douglas Phelps?" He said, "That is your decision, not mine. I can only tell you what I want and what I am prepared to do. What you do with that is entirely yours." She was quiet for a long moment. A wagon went by on the street. Somewhere down the block a door opened and closed. The whole ordinary world continued its business while the two of them stood on the boardwalk in the amber afternoon and held everything at the edge of a decision. She said, "I need time to think, Grant." He said, "That is fair," she said, "and I need you to understand that I do not find this simple or easy." He said, "I know that. And I am sorry I made it harder than it needed to be." She nodded once, a precise, composed nod, and she walked away down the boardwalk toward her house, and he watched her go and felt the particular mix of fear and hope that is the condition of a man who has said everything and now has to wait to learn whether it was enough. He went to the livery and saw to copper. He went to the hotel and paid for a room. He bathed and ate and lay on the bed in the early evening listening to the sounds of Caldwell Creek, the faint music from the dusty rail, the creak of wagons, a dog barking at a distance. And he thought about Adelaide's face when he had said what he said, and what was in it, and whether he had read it right. She came to find him the next morning. He was at the hotel dining room, eating his breakfast and drinking his coffee and trying not to think too hard about what the day might bring, and she came through the door in her good gray dress with her hair pinned neat and her back straight, and she crossed the room and sat down across from him without being invited, which told him something before she said a word. He put down his coffee and looked at her. She folded her hands on the table and said, "I spoke with Douglas Phelps last night." He waited. She said, "I told him that I had to end the courtship." He let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. She said, "This is not easy for me to say. Douglas is a decent man, and he did not deserve to be treated inconsiderately, and I want you to understand that I am not doing this lightly." He said, "I know," she said, "and I am not doing it simply because you rode back to town and said fine words, Grant Granger. I am doing it because I have been honest with myself since yesterday afternoon, and the honest truth is that the reason I accepted Douglas Phelps's courtship in the first place was because I had given up hoping you would say what you have now said." She looked at him steadily. "And the further honest truth is that those words from you, even from you, dusty and delayed as they were, meant more to me than 3 months of proper attentiveness from Douglas Phelps." He looked at her. Something behind his eyes was very bright and very warm. He said, "Adelaide," she said, "do not make me regret being honest with you." He said, "I will spend the rest of my life making sure you do not." She looked at him for a moment, and then she looked down at her folded hands, and he could see the faint color in her cheeks and the slight softening of the careful lines around her mouth. She said, "You mentioned land east of town." He said, "Ed Birch's parcel. I have been in conversation with him for months. I have the money from the drive." She said, "How much land?" He said, 160 acres with a creek running the eastern boundary and a stand of cottonwoods in the north corner." She said, "Is there a house?" He said, "There is the start of one. Ed Birch laid a foundation and built 2 walls before his wife decided she preferred town, and it has been sitting there ever since. I would have to finish it." She said, "Can you build a house, Grant Granger?" He said, "I can learn." Something moved across her face that was the closest thing to a smile she had allowed herself all morning, and it undid him completely. He said, "Adelaide, will you let me court you, properly this time, with full intention and full honesty, and no more trail drives until I have made everything clear?" She said, "I believe you have made everything tolerably clear at this point, yes." He said, "Is that a yes?" She said, "That is a yes." And then more quietly, "Grant, I am glad you came back." He said, "I was always coming back. I should have made that clearer before I left." She said, "Yes, you should have." But the way she said it was not sharp anymore. It was gentle, the way things are when the edge of a wound has been addressed and is beginning to close. They finished breakfast together. She ordered tea and he ordered more coffee, and the woman who ran the dining room gave them a look of pure satisfaction. And they talked for an hour in the warm morning light about practical things and impractical things, about the land and the house and the school, and whether cottonwood trees provided much shade in summer, and what crops grew well in this part of Kansas, and whether copper was going to resent being in a stable instead of on the trail. It was the most ordinary conversation, and it felt to both of them like the beginning of everything. Douglas Phelps left Caldwell Creek the following week. He was, as Adelaide had said, a decent man, and he bore his disappointment with a grace that Grant respected and felt a little guilty about. He shook Phelps's hand the morning the man boarded the eastbound stage, and Phelps looked at him with clear eyes and said, "Take good care of her, Granger." And Grant said he intended to, and that was that. The stage pulled away, and Douglas Phelps went back east, and Caldwell Creek resettled itself around his absence the way water fills a space. Grant bought Ed Birch's parcel in mid-August. with a handshake and a signed paper and the sum of 2 years' savings. Ed Birch, who was 60 and whose wife Marion had strong opinions about the inconveniences of ranch living, seemed quietly relieved and shook Grant's hand with genuine warmth and said, "You'll make something good out of that land, son." And Grant thought of Adelaide and said he certainly intended to. The next 3 months were among the busiest of Grant's life. He finished the house on the Birch parcel. He hired Cal Deering's oldest boy and a carpenter from the neighboring town to help, and he worked alongside them every day, learning as he went. And what emerged by October was a solid, modest structure with 4 rooms, a stone fireplace, a good kitchen, a wide porch facing east toward the creek, and 2 windows in the front room that let in the morning light beautifully. He was genuinely proud of it. In the particular way, a man is proud of something he built with his own hands, and more effort than he knew he had. Adelaide came to see it in early October, on a Sunday afternoon when the cottonwoods had gone yellow, and the creek caught the light in bright flashes through the trees. She walked through every room slowly, with her hands clasped behind her back and her eyes taking everything in, and he followed her and watched her face and did not say anything because he wanted her response to be entirely her own. She stood at the east-facing window in the front room for a long time, looking out at the creek and the yellowed trees and the open sky above the land, and then she turned to him and said, "It is a fine house, Grant Granger." He said, "It needs a great deal yet. Curtains and proper furniture and everything else that makes a house a home rather than a structure," she said. "That is true of most houses." He looked at her in the morning light that came through the uncurtained window and said, "Adelaide, I would like to ask you something." She turned to face him fully. She was entirely composed and entirely present, and he could see both the patience and the hope in her, held carefully in the same space. He said, "I would like to ask you to marry me." She looked at him. Outside the window, the wind moved through the cottonwoods and sent a cloud of yellow leaves spinning across the creek. She said, "Grant Granger." He said, "I know the timing could be argued about," she said. Grant Granger stopped talking for a moment. He stopped. She said, "I would be honored to marry you." He crossed the room in 3 steps and took her hands in both of his, and she looked up at him with those brown eyes that were not composed now at all, but were bright and warm and entirely open. And he thought he had never in his life seen anything more beautiful than this woman in this room. With the autumn light coming through the window, and the cottonwoods turning gold outside, and everything that had been uncertain and delayed, and almost too late finally arriving at the right place. He bent his head and kissed her, the first time, careful and certain, and full of everything that words had not been able to carry efficiently. And she kissed him back with a warmth that answered every question he had ever had about whether she felt what he felt. They married in November, at the leaning white church that had by this time been propped back up to something approaching vertical by the efforts of the congregation and 2 new support beams. The ceremony was conducted by the Reverend Samuel Tate, who was a kind and practical man who had married a fair number of frontier couples and always felt that the frontier gave a particular weight to the words, as though saying them out here, with so much open country all around, made them go deeper. Adelaide wore her good dress, the blue one that matched the winter sky, and Grant wore a dark suit he had purchased in Wichita and had not yet had occasion to wear. He had also finally shaved, and he looked, according to Esther Vance, who said it loudly and without embarrassment, almost unbearably handsome. Martha Fielding cried. Old Clem, the fiddle player, played at the reception in the church hall, and on this occasion he appeared to have practiced, because the music was nearly precise. Grant danced with Adelaide twice and then again, because she told him she liked dancing with him, and he told her he liked dancing with her as well, particularly when it was Adelaide he was dancing with, and she gave him a look that made Esther Vance laugh from across the room. They went home to the house on the creek in the late afternoon, with the November sky going violet above the cottonwoods and the first real cold of the coming winter in the air. He carried her over the threshold, which she told him was not strictly necessary, and he told her it was entirely necessary, and he would not be argued with on this point. And she laughed, a real laugh, the kind she did not give easily, low and warm and completely unguarded, and he held that sound in his chest like something he had been waiting for without knowing it. They settled into the life of the ranch, and the town with the practical intensity of two people who have both waited longer than they wanted to, and are now determined to make everything count. She continued teaching, because the school needed her, and because she loved it, and because Grant would never have dreamed of asking her to stop. He worked the land and built up a small herd, learning ranching at a scale different from trail work. The daily, rooted, accumulating labor of a man growing something of his own rather than moving other people's cattle from one place to another. The winter of 1874 going into 1875 was hard but not crushing. The house on the creek was warm and solid, and Adelaide had made it into a home with the quick efficiency of a woman who knows exactly what she wants and where it should go. There were curtains now and a braided rug, and a shelf of books that occupied the wall beside the stone fireplace, and she had put a pot of dried wildflowers on the kitchen table in the place where, in summer, there would be fresh ones. In the evenings they sat by the fire and read, and talked, and played cards, and had the kinds of conversations that only become possible between two people who have committed to the same life, and can therefore stop being careful with each other in the particular way that the uncommitted must always be. He told her things he had not told anyone. She told him things she had kept close for a long time. The distance between them that had been carefully maintained through 2 years of almost saying things dissolved entirely, and what was left was something that felt like ease, not the ease of indifference, but the ease of complete familiarity, the ease of being known. In early March of 1875, Adelaide told him she was expecting a child. He was in the barn at the time, doing something routine with the tack, and she came out to find him because she had known all day and had kept the knowledge inside her like a lamp all through the school day and the walk home and the making of supper, and now she could not keep it 1 minute longer. She stood in the barn doorway with the late winter light behind her and told him, and he went entirely still for a moment, and then he was across the space between them and she was in his arms, and she felt him breathing against her hair, and after a moment he pulled back to look at her face and said, "Adelaide," in a voice she had never heard from him before, soft and shaken and full of something that did not have a proper word. She said, "Are you pleased?" He said, "I am stunned and overwhelmed and I think I may need to sit down." He did not sit down. He kept holding her hands. He said, "I am more pleased than I have words for." The pregnancy went well by the standards of 1875 on the Kansas frontier, which meant it was difficult and uncertain, and required Adelaide to accept the help of others with a grace that was somewhat foreign to her independent nature, and that she was always more comfortable at the end of the day knowing that Grant was there, and that the child was coming, and that everything was going to be all right. He worried about her with a constancy that she found both touching and occasionally excessive, and she told him so, and he told her that he was allowed to worry and she was not going to talk him out of it, and she told him he was stubborn, and he told her she was the one calling the kettle black on that particular subject, and she laughed, and everything was fine. The baby arrived in October of 1875, a Tuesday evening, with Esther Vance serving as midwife and Grant pacing the porch, with the studied deliberateness of a man trying to appear calmer than he is. The baby was a boy, healthy and loud, and when Esther put him in Grant's arms in the lamplight of the kitchen, and he looked down at the red, indignant face of his son, he felt something in the center of himself that he did not have a frame of reference for, something enormous and quiet at the same time, like the feeling of standing at the edge of the open prairie in the early morning when everything is still. Adelaide, exhausted and bright-eyed from the bed where Esther had settled her, said, "Well, what do you think of him?" Grant looked at the baby in his arms and looked at his wife and said, "I think he is the best thing I have ever had a hand in." She smiled, the wide, warm smile she saved for him, and said, "What shall we name him?" They had talked about names for months, going through possibilities the way you go through a market, setting some aside and returning to others. They had agreed on Thomas for a boy after her father, with James as a middle name for his own father who was still working cattle in Texas, and had written a letter full of delight and misspelled words when informed of the forthcoming grandchild. Thomas James Granger was a loud and vigorous baby who made his opinions known at all hours, and who looked, within the first few weeks, remarkably like his father. The same amber eyes, the same set to the jaw that would eventually be as stubborn as a mule fence. Grant was devoted to him in the unself-conscious way of a man who had not expected to be so thoroughly altered by fatherhood, and is discovering that he does not mind being altered at all. Adelaide came back to teaching in January, after a 3-month absence that the school had navigated with the help of Martha Fielding's sister Ellen, who had some education and enough patience to manage the younger children. The town had continued to grow. There were now close to 400 people in Caldwell Creek, and the bank had been established, and the telegraph line had arrived, and there was talk of a second general store and possibly a doctor. The frontier was becoming something more settled and more complicated, and Adelaide was at the center of it, still teaching, still essential, still the woman that half the families in the county trusted with their children's minds. Grant expanded the herd in the spring of 1876, with a careful purchase of 20 additional cattle from a rancher south of town, who was looking to reduce his operation. He hired a young hand named Pete Alcott, 17 and eager and genuinely skilled with horses, who reminded Grant of himself at that age without the particular caution that had been, in Grant's case, both a strength and a liability. He taught Pete what he knew about cattle and horses and working land, the way his own father had taught him, and found that teaching was a pleasure he had not anticipated. The ranch grew steadily, with the specific slow growth of something that has been properly founded. There was no boom, no dramatic windfall, only the accumulation of good work and good decisions, and the kind of discipline that comes from having something real to lose and something real to build. By the summer of 1876, the Granger Ranch was well regarded in the county, their cattle known to be well cared for and their land well managed. It was in the summer of 1876 that Grant's father, James Granger, came up from Texas. He was 60 years old and he had been working cattle since he was 16, and he had the look of a man who has been outside in all weathers for 44 years, which is to say he looked like old and honest timber, weathered and solid, and still entirely sound. He arrived on the stage with a single bag and a slight stiffness in his right knee that he made no mention of, and Grant met him at the stage office, and they shook hands, and then, after a brief pause, Grant pulled his father into an embrace that was slightly awkward for both of them in the way that physical affection between two reticent men always is, and James Granger patted his son's back twice and said, "Good to see you, son. You look well." He stayed for a month, and it was one of the best months Grant could remember. His father and Adelaide liked each other from the first meeting, because James Granger was a man of honesty and plain dealing, and Adelaide recognized and respected these qualities immediately, and because Adelaide had a patience with the older generation that came from having spent so long in her father's company. James held Thomas and looked at him with the careful tenderness of a grandfather and told Grant that the boy had his eyes, and Grant said he thought so too, and James said, "That is to his credit," which made Adelaide press her lips together to keep from laughing. In the evenings, James Granger told stories of the old Texas ranges, stories that Grant had heard pieces of as a child and was now hearing completed, and Adelaide listened with genuine interest and occasionally asked a question that made the old man look at her with approval, and Grant sat across the fire from the two people who were most important to him in the world and felt something settle in him that had been restless for a long time. When James left at the end of August, he shook Grant's hand on the stage platform and then held his hand for a moment and said, I am proud of you, what you've built here, and that woman," he shook his head. "That is the right woman, Grant. You should be grateful every day." Grant said, "I am." His father said, "Good," and let go of his hand and got on the stage, and Grant stood watching until it was gone. By 1877, Caldwell Creek had grown into a proper town, with a full-time doctor at last, a young man named Dr. Warren Hale who had come from Indiana with his wife Clara, and an enthusiasm for frontier medicine that was both admirable and occasionally alarming. Grant liked him for his directness and his intelligence. Adelaide liked Clara Hale, who was educated and funny, and brought something vivid and engaging to the women's community of Caldwell Creek that had previously been composed primarily of the practical and the resilient. The two women became close friends with the natural ease of like minds finding each other, and their friendship added something to the life of the town that everyone felt without being entirely able to articulate. In the spring of 1877, Adelaide told Grant she was expecting again. Thomas was a year and a half old and loud and fast, already running on uncertain legs around the porch and into the yard, and toward the creek with a confidence that required almost constant surveillance, and the prospect of another child filled both of them with a joy that had underneath it the particular complex texture of parents who are already somewhat outnumbered. The second child was a girl, born in November of 1877, on a cold, clear night when the stars above the Kansas plain were extraordinary. They named her Clara Jane Granger Clara for Adelaide's new friend, which Clara Hale cried about, and Jane for Grant's mother, which the memory of his mother seemed to deserve. She had Adelaide's brown eyes and Grant's stubborn jaw, and from the first days of her life, a disposition of cheerful determination that suggested she had arrived with plans. The family settled into itself around these two children with the organic adjustments of a household that is alive and growing. Thomas became the kind of older brother who is simultaneously protective and maddening, following Clara everywhere and insisting on carrying things for her, while she developed an early resistance to being carried anywhere that she could walk. Grant managed this with patience, and a private enjoyment he tried not to make too obvious. Adelaide managed it with the expertise of a woman who had been managing the behavior of children professionally for years. The ranch continued its steady growth. Grant hired a second hand in 1878, a man named Roy Castro who had come up from Texas with good references and a skill with cattle that Pete Alcott openly admired, and the operation became something that required proper organization and management, which Grant provided with the quiet competence that had always been his most consistent quality. In the evenings, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, he and Adelaide had the time that is most particular to people who have built something together, the time that belongs only to them, when the noise and the requirement of the day is gone, and what remains is the simple fact of two people who have chosen each other. They sat on the east porch in the summer evenings and watched the creek in the dying light, and in the winter they sat by the fire with their books and their conversation, and Grant often reached across and took her hand with the quiet ease of a man for whom this gesture has become as natural as breathing, and she always let him, and sometimes she turned her hand so their fingers were properly interlaced, and the fire crackled, and outside the Kansas night was wide and dark and full of stars. There was an evening in the late summer of 1879 when Thomas was nearly 4 and Clara was almost 2, and the long golden light of late August was lying across the creek in the way it only does at the end of summer, when everything has reached its fullest possible gold before the turning. Adelaide was on the porch with Clara on her lap, braiding a clover chain and letting the baby pull it apart, and Grant came out of the barn after the evening's work and stood at the edge of the porch and looked at his wife and daughter in the evening light and felt the full weight of all of it, the decision to come back, the words he had finally found the courage to say, the answer she had given him, the life they had made together in this specific place on the Kansas prairie. and it was so complete and so much more than he had known how to want that it took him a moment to find his breath. Adelaide looked up from the clover chain and saw his face, and she said, "What is it?" He said, "Nothing. Everything is fine." He sat down on the step beside her. Clara immediately transferred her interest from the clover chain to her father's hat, which she removed from his head with both hands and put on her own. He let her because he always let her. Adelaide looked at him with those brown eyes that could always see through to the back of a thing. She said, "You are doing the thing you do when you are thinking something large." He said, "What thing is that?" She said, "You get very still and you look at something that is not there." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at Clara in his hat, small and imperious and entirely pleased with herself. He looked at Adelaide beside him, her hair beginning to come loose from its pins in the way it always did by the end of the afternoon, her face warm and present and infinitely known. He said, "I was thinking that I am glad I came back, that August." She looked at him steadily. He said, "And that you told me I was too late." She said, "I did tell you that." He said, "You did, and I told you to define too late and that I would prove you wrong." She said softly, "You did, and you have." He looked at her for a long moment and then he said, "Were you truly certain, that day, that it was too late?" She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything with her whole intelligence applied. She said, "No, I was not certain. I was frightened and I was protecting myself, and too late was the armor I put on. I had been waiting for you to say what you finally said, and when you kept not saying it, I convinced myself that the feeling on my side was something that needed to be corrected." He said, "And Douglas Phelps was part of the correction." She said, "He was what comes of a woman trying to be sensible when she does not want to be sensible." He took her hand, the simple familiar gesture, and she turned her palm so their fingers interlaced. He said, "I am sorry it took me so long to say it clearly," she said. "I am sorry I did not tell you sooner what I needed to hear." She looked at the creek, golden in the late light. "We were both afraid, Grant, in different ways." He said, "Yes," she said, "and we are here now." He said, "We are here now." Clara, who had been listening to this exchange with the polite incomprehension of a 2-year-old, handed the hat back to her father with an expression of great generosity, and Adelaide laughed, and Grant put the hat on lopsided and leaned over and kissed his wife on the temple, and the evening settled in around them, warm and complete and theirs. Thomas turned 5 in October of 1880, old enough to start his formal schooling, which created the particular situation in which Adelaide became Thomas's teacher for part of the day and his mother for the rest. And Thomas responded to this development with the philosophical adaptability of a child who understood at some deep instinctive level that his mother's patience was the same in both roles, but her expectations were equally high in each. He was a good student, which Adelaide was professionally pleased by and personally unsurprised by, since he had his father's thorough and retentive mind and her own habits of precision. Clara was proving to be everything a second child in a frontier household could be: vigorous, curious, self-possessed, and almost comically fearless. By the time she was 3, she had already determined that horses were interesting, and that the fence between the yard and the corral was a navigable obstacle rather than a barrier. Grant caught her on the fence rail one afternoon, watching the horses with an expression of pure scientific assessment, and instead of alarm, he felt a recognition that was almost paternal pride, which he mentioned to Adelaide, who said that if their daughter ended up learning to break horses, he would have only himself to blame, and he said he would consider that an outcome. By 1881, the Granger Ranch had become one of the more substantial operations in the county, not the largest, but well managed and well regarded, with a herd that was consistently of good quality and a reputation for fair dealing that brought buyers back year after year. Grant had also, in the winter of 1880, written to his father again, and James Granger, who was 64 and feeling the weight of the Texas ranch more than he wanted to admit, had written back with what for him was considerable feeling, and the correspondence had become more regular than it had been in the years of Grant's early wandering. In the spring of 1882, James Granger arrived in Caldwell Creek again, and this time he did not come for a month. He came with the rest of his belongings, which were few, and he settled into the small room at the back of the Granger house that Grant had framed out in the winter with exactly this in mind. And he became part of the household with the quiet ease of a man who has run out of reasons to be anywhere else, and has found that family is, after all, what he was missing. Thomas was 6 by this time and took immediately to his grandfather, trailing the old man around the ranch with the same inquisitive thoroughness he applied to his school books. James Granger taught the boy to identify cattle by their traits and temperament, and to read the weather by the look of the sky, and to take care of a horse properly from foot to ear, and Thomas absorbed all of it with the focused intensity that was his most defining characteristic. Clara watched her grandfather from a slight distance for the first week, with the particular assessment of a child who was not inclined to trust anyone immediately, and then decided that he was acceptable and attached herself to him with a sudden and complete warmth that the old man clearly found both startling and deeply satisfying. He took to carrying her on his shoulders when he walked the property, and she sat up there with the confidence of someone surveying a domain, and Grant watched this and felt the specific fullness of watching two people you love finding their way to each other. Adelaide managed the expanded household with the same competent grace she brought to everything, making room for James without diminishing anything else, feeding him into the rhythms of the house so naturally that within a month it seemed as though he had always been there. James Granger, who was a man of few words and careful observation, told Grant one evening when they were alone in the barn that Adelaide was the kind of woman who makes everything around her better, and that Grant had done the smartest thing of his life when he came back that August in 1874 and refused to accept that it was too late. Grant said, "I nearly didn't come back, nearly stayed in Dodge City and told myself it was already finished." James said, "What stopped you?" Grant said, "She did, the thought of her. I couldn't make the thought of her stop, and eventually I stopped trying." His father was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Your mother was like that for me. Once she was in my mind, there was no getting her out." Grant said, I know that now." They were quiet together in the barn with the horses shifting and the evening coming in, and it was one of those silences that is full rather than empty, the kind that means something has been understood without needing to be said again. The years moved through the 1880s with the particular rhythm of a well-established life, not without difficulty, because difficulty is the condition of life on the frontier, with the dry summers and the severe winters and the uncertain markets and the periodic losses that are part of ranching in any era. There were hard years and easier years, and through all of them the Granger household held its ground, rooted in the creekside land and in the partnership of two people who had learned each other deeply and built accordingly. In 1883, Adelaide was appointed to serve on the newly formed county school board, which gave her a role beyond the Caldwell Creek schoolroom, a platform for the improvements she had been advocating for years: better materials, longer school terms, recognition of the importance of education for children who lived far from town and often missed weeks at a time during harvest or severe weather. She was the only woman on the board, a fact she was aware of with a clear-eyed pragmatism, and she navigated the political currents of that position with the same intelligent patience she brought to everything. She made things better, incrementally and persistently, the way that change usually happens when it happens at all. Grant was proud of her in a way that was not at all complicated, which was the best kind of pride. He told her so, plainly and without qualification, and she received his pride with the directness of a woman who was accustomed to being capable, but not always accustomed to being told so by someone who loved her, and it continued to matter to her in ways she was not embarrassed to acknowledge. Thomas at 10 was becoming something that was visibly and pleasingly a combination of both of his parents. His father's steadiness and his mother's precision, his father's skill with the physical world, and his mother's love of books. He read everything he could lay hands on, which in Caldwell Creek in the early 1880s was somewhat limited, but Adelaide supplemented with orders from the bookshop in Wichita and occasional acquisitions from traveling traders, and Thomas consumed everything and asked for more. He had also, by 10, developed a competence with horses that genuinely impressed Grant, who did not impress easily when it came to horsemanship. Clara at 8 was everything she had promised to be at 2, full of a vigorous intelligence that moved sideways more often than forward, preferring the question that hadn't been asked to the one that had, more interested in the practical mechanics of how things worked than in the theoretical account of why they were supposed to. She had her grandfather's patience with the physical details of ranch work and her mother's refusal to accept an inadequate answer to a genuine question, and Grant thought she was going to be extraordinary and told Adelaide so, and Adelaide said she was going to give them both gray hair, and they were both right. James Granger's health began to slow him visibly in 1884. His knee, which he had never mentioned, became a matter he could no longer not mention, and Dr. Warren Hale examined him and said it was the years of riding and cold, and the kind of wear that cannot be undone, only accommodated. James accommodated it with the philosophical stubbornness of a man who has never found complaint useful, and he reduced his walking and increased his sitting, which was its own kind of indignity for a man who had been in motion for 67 years. But he sat on the east porch in the mornings with Thomas and taught him everything he could teach sitting down, and the boy sat beside him and listened with the serious attention that was the best of both his parents, and it was, by any measure, time well spent. James Granger died in January of 1885, quietly in the room at the back of the Granger house, on a cold night when the snow was coming down on the Kansas plain in the serious way it comes in January. He had been in declining health for several weeks, and Dr. Hale had been attentive, and the family had gathered around him in the quiet way that families do when something that has been a long time coming is finally arriving. He died with Grant's hand in his and Adelaide sitting on the other side of the bed, and Clara asleep on a pallet in the corner because she had refused to leave, and Thomas standing at the foot of the bed with his hands clasped, and his face very composed in the way he had when he was working very hard to hold something steady. They buried him in the Caldwell Creek Cemetery, beside the creek on the eastern edge of town, on a gray January morning, and most of the town came because most of the town had known him for 3 years and liked him for his quietness and his dry occasional humor and his obvious pride in his son and his grandchildren. Grant stood at the grave and felt the loss of his father as a clean, deep thing, not unexpected, but real in the way the losses of people we have finally come to fully know always are. Adelaide stood beside him and held his hand through the whole of the service, and afterward, when they were walking back through the gray, cold morning, she said nothing but stayed close, her shoulder against his arm, and that was everything he needed. The spring of 1885 came in with the persistent spring always has, the determined return of green and warmth that is almost argumentative after a Kansas winter. The ranch resumed its pace. Adelaide resumed the school board meetings with renewed energy. Thomas helped with the ranch work after school with a seriousness that was almost adult. Clara invented projects for herself that required the participation of the entire household and accepted no declination. It was that spring, in April, that Adelaide told Grant she was expecting again. They were both 35, and this was their third, and the news carried with it a mix of joy and thoughtfulness that was different from the first 2 times, not less, but more layered, the joy of people who know exactly what they are undertaking and are choosing it anyway. The third baby came in October of 1885, as the cottonwoods along the creek went yellow again, and the land took on its autumn color. He was a boy, healthy and solid, and they named him James Samuel Granger James for the grandfather who had died in January, Samuel for the Reverend Tate who had married them and who had been a steady presence in their lives for 11 years. It felt right on both counts. Thomas, at 9, received the news of a second brother with a considered dignity. Clara, at 7, received it with the kind of intense practical interest she brought to all new developments, and was immediately concerned with the logistical details of where the baby would sleep, and what he would be called, and whether he would be, in her assessment, interesting. She declared him interesting within the first week, and her assessment proved more or less correct. By 1887, Caldwell Creek had grown into something that was unmistakably a small town rather than a frontier settlement. There was a proper bank, 2 general stores, a hotel with an actual dining room, a barber shop, a hardware merchant, a telegraph office, a physician, and a school with 2 rooms now, Adelaide having finally persuaded the county to fund the addition. The white church had been rebuilt entirely, no longer listing, but proper and straight, with a bell that could be heard across the full width of the town. The dusty rail saloon had expanded and acquired a piano player of genuine skill. The frontier was receding, not disappearing entirely, but moving further west, and what was left behind was becoming something more settled and more permanent. The Granger Ranch sat on its creekside parcel east of town, solid and rooted. The house expanded now with an additional room on the back for the growing family and a new barn built to accommodate the increased herd. The cottonwood trees in the north corner had grown over 13 years into something genuinely impressive, tall and broad, their shade covering a wide area of ground in summer, and their leaves turning the best possible gold in October. The creek ran clear along the eastern boundary, and in summer the children swam in the deep bend where the water pooled, and Grant had built a small dock from boards and will, and in the evenings the whole family sometimes sat on the bank and watched the water go by, which was one of Adelaide's preferred things to do on summer evenings, and therefore one of Grant's preferred things as well. Thomas, at 15, was talking about going to college. Not next year, or even the year after, but as a serious consideration for the future. Adelaide had planted this idea carefully and deliberately over years of conversation about education and possibility, and what a thorough mind deserved to be given, and Thomas had grown into it the way a plant grows into the light from a window. Grant was supportive in the way that a man who taught himself to read at 14 from a Bible and a Dickens novel is always going to be supportive of someone else getting a proper formal education, with a particular emphasis on the someone else not having to do it the hard way. Clara, at 13, had become someone who was specifically and distinctly herself in a way that continued to both delight and occasionally exhaust her parents. She had taken a serious interest in horses in the practical sense, the management and care and training of them, and Grant had given over the handling of 2 of the younger horses almost entirely to her, with Pete Alcott supervising and reporting back with thinly concealed admiration. She had also, somehow, decided that she was going to learn everything the school had to teach, not because she was conventional but because she believed in being thoroughly armed with information, and she was the best student in the school, which was not a competition she was running in but a fact that existed regardless. James, at 2, was a creature of pure cheerful momentum who had opinions about everything and the vocabulary to share them, not always in the right words but always with considerable conviction. He had his grandfather's name and something of his grandfather's eyes, a specific amber gold that was Grant's as well, and he had Adelaide's capacity for frank assessment, which in a 2-year-old was a power that occasionally alarmed visitors. In the summer of 1887, Grant and Adelaide sat on the east porch one evening in the particular peace of a summer night when the children are all in bed, and the ranch is quiet, and the creek makes its small sound in the darkness beyond the yard. The stars were out in the way they are only on clear Kansas nights, not scattered but thick, a density of light that makes the sky feel close and immense at the same time. Adelaide had her feet up on the porch railing, which was something she only allowed herself when the children were asleep and propriety was off duty, and she was looking at the stars with the kind of settled attention she gave to things she genuinely loved. Grant was sitting beside her with his coffee, which was the last cup of the day, and he was looking at her the way he had always looked at her when she wasn't watching, with the full undefended force of what he felt, which was enormous and specific and entirely hers. She said without looking away from the stars. "What are you thinking about?" he said. 13 years ago this summer," she said, "when you rode back from Dodge City." He said, "Yes." She looked at him then, turning her head on the back of the rocking chair. In the lamplight from the window, her face was warm and familiar and everything he had needed it to be for a long time now. She said, "I almost sent you away." He said, "You did send me away." She said, "I tried. I told you it was too late." He said, "You told me it was too late, and I asked you to define the term, and you gave me the chance to prove you wrong, and I spent the next several months doing exactly that." She smiled, the full warm smile, the one she had always saved for moments that were genuinely worth it. She said, "You proved the case adequately." He said, "I was motivated." She said, "You were insufferably determined is what you were." He said, "It is a quality I come by honestly." She said, "Yes, I have noticed that about you." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Grant, I am glad I did not manage to mean it when I said it was too late." He said, "So am I. I was afraid that you did mean it." She said, "Part of me thought I did, but the larger part of me was standing on the boardwalk outside the school hoping with everything I had that you would not accept it." He said, "Why didn't you say so?" She said, "Because I had my pride and I had given my word to another man, and I was not sure that hope was something I could let myself be seen having." He said, "Adelaide," she said, "I know, we were both afraid." He said, "We were both afraid." He reached out and took her hand from the armrest of the rocking chair, and she turned her palm so their fingers interlaced. "And here we are," she said, "here we are." She squeezed his hand once. "3 children and a ranch and a school board and all of it." He said, "All of it." They sat in the summer night and held hands and looked at the stars and listened to the creek, and the house was quiet behind them, with the particular quality of a house that is full of people who belong in it and are resting. After a while she said, "Grant." He said, She said, "I think James is going to need a second teacher before he finishes school. He has opinions about everything." He said, "He comes by it honestly." She said, "From which side?" He said, "Both sides, Adelaide." Equally and without qualification. She laughed, the real laugh, low and warm, the one that had been his favorite sound for 13 years and showed no sign of becoming less so. The creek moved in the darkness. The stars hung enormous and close above the Kansas plain. The lamp in the window burned steady against the summer night. Grant Granger, who had once been a man with no roots and no particular plan, who had almost talked himself out of coming back, who had stood on a boardwalk in the August dust and refused to accept the definition of too late that was offered to him, looked at his wife's hand in his and at the house behind them and at the land that was his and hers and theirs, and he understood, with the complete and settled clarity of a man who has arrived exactly where he was always meant to be, that every mile of trail and every year of caution and every moment of almost saying it and finally saying it had brought him here, to this porch, to this woman, to this life. And it was, beyond any shadow of argument, more than enough. It was everything. Adelaide rested her head against the back of her chair and looked at the stars and held his hand and felt the warmth of the summer night and the presence of the man beside her, the man who had ridden back across 100 miles and stood in her dust and refused to let too late be the last word. And she thought of all the versions of her life that had not happened, the one where she had meant what she said, the one where he had not come back, the one where she had chosen caution over the thing that was true. And she felt for all of those versions a compassion that was the compassion of someone who has not had to live them. The creek moved. The stars held. The summer night breathed warm and full around them, and everything was resolved, and everything was whole, and they sat together on the east porch of the house on the creek and let the goodness of it be exactly what it was.